In the final weeks of World War II, when Germany was collapsing and most people believed the fighting was almost over, a small stone fortress in the Austrian Alps became the center of one of the strangest and most forgotten battles of the entire war. It was not a famous beach, not a capital city, and not a massive front line. It was a medieval castle sitting quietly above a village called Itter, and inside that castle, a tiny group of exhausted soldiers, no more than 9 men at the start, were about to face a German force many times their size. The castle had been standing for centuries. Long before Hitler, long before tanks and aircraft, during the war, the Nazis had turned it into a special prison. But these were not ordinary prisoners. Inside Castle Itter were some of France's most important figures, former prime ministers, generals, and high-ranking officials. Men who knew secrets, men whose survival mattered politically, even as the Third Reich was dying. By May 1945, these prisoners knew something was changing. Guards were nervous. Orders were unclear. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the valleys. Germany was losing, but that did not mean the danger was over. As the Nazi command structure collapsed, discipline inside the prison vanished. One by one, the SS guards abandoned their posts. At first, this seemed like good news, but the prisoners soon realized the truth was far worse. Without guards, they were no longer protected by anyone. Outside the castle, armed SS units still loyal to Hitler were roaming the area, refusing to surrender. If those units reached Castle Itter, the prisoners would almost certainly be executed. Late on May 4th, a Yugoslav prisoner named Zvonimir Kukovic volunteered for a desperate mission. He slipped out of the castle and rode a bicycle through the mountains, carrying a message begging for help. After hours of avoiding German patrols, he reached American forces pushing through Austria. The message was simple and terrifying. High value, your prisoners were trapped in Castle Itter and under imminent threat. The message reached a small American unit commanded by Captain John C. Jack. Lee Jr. Lee was a tank commander with the 12th Armored Division. He was not supposed to lead rescue missions into unknown territory with the war nearly over. But when he read the message, he understood there was no time to wait for orders. He gathered what he could: a single Sherman tank, later nicknamed Basat and Jenny, and a handful of infantry. When they rolled toward Itter, Lee had fewer than a dozen soldiers under his command. At the core of the defense would be just 9 men. As they approached the village of Itter, they encountered something almost unbelievable. A German Wehrmacht officer approached under a white flag. His name was Major Joseph Gangl. He had turned against the SS and was trying to protect Austrian civilians from fanatical Nazi units still fighting. Gangl knew about the castle and the prisoners inside. He also knew an SS attack was coming. In a moment that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war, Gangl offered to fight alongside the Americans. So it was that night, under dark alpine skies. A tiny and unlikely force prepared to defend Castle Itter. American soldiers, a German officer, a handful of Austrian resistance fighters, and inside the castle walls, elderly French politicians who had once commanded armies of their own. Against them stood an SS unit numbering well over 100 men, armed with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. Captain Lee quickly realized the castle was both a blessing and a trap. Its thick stone walls offered protection, but its position on a hill meant it was isolated. If the SS surrounded it, escape would be nearly impossible. Worse, Lee's tank could barely maneuver on the narrow road leading up to the gate. Still, there was no alternative. They would hold the castle or die there. As dawn broke on May 5th, the SS attack began. Rifle fire cracked across the valley. Bullets struck the stone walls, chipping away pieces of centuries-old masonry. The defenders took positions at windows and battlements, firing back carefully, conserving ammunition. Every shot mattered. There were no reserves, no backup, just 9 men holding key positions. Buying time with each passing minute, inside the castle, the French prisoners refused to hide. Despite their age and years of captivity, some insisted on helping. They carried ammunition, relayed messages, and even took up captured weapons. One of them, former French Prime Minister Paul Renaud, later recalled the surreal nature of the moment. Men who had once argued in Parliament were now crouched behind medieval walls. Listening to SS bullets whine past their heads, the SS quickly realized this was not an unguarded target. They brought up heavier weapons and began probing for weaknesses. Machine gun fire intensified. Mortar rounds exploded near the gate. One shell struck close enough to shake the entire castle. Dust filled the air. For a brief moment, it seemed only a matter of time before the attackers overwhelmed the defenders through sheer numbers. Then disaster nearly struck. The Sherman tank Besotten Jenny, positioned near the gate as the castle's strongest weapon, became a primary target. An SS anti-tank round slammed into it, disabling the tank and killing its radio. The castle's biggest gun was now silent. Worse, communication with the outside world was cut. For Captain Lee and his men, the situation had become critical. If the SS broke through now, there would be nothing to stop them. Despite the chaos, the 9-man corps of defenders did not break. They shifted positions, covering each other, moving constantly to avoid sniper fire. Major Gangle exposed himself repeatedly, directing fire and encouraging the men. He understood the terrain better than anyone, and used that knowledge to slow the SS advance. Each minute they held was a victory, but time was running out. Ammunition was low. Several defenders were wounded. The SS were closing in, their confidence growing as they realized how small the defending force really was. Inside the castle, everyone knew the truth. If reinforcements did not arrive soon, this battle would end in a massacre. Then, just as the situation reached its breaking point, distant engine noise echoed through the valley. At first, no one dared to believe it, but the sound grew louder. Automatic gunfire erupted from the SS rear. Shouts echoed in confusion. The Americans had come. Elements of the 142nd Infantry Regiment, advancing rapidly through the area, had received word of the fight. They attacked the SS forces from behind, catching them completely off guard. Within minutes, the balance of power shifted. The SS, who moments earlier had been on the verge of victory, began to retreat or surrender. The battle was over. When the smoke cleared, Castle Itter still stood. The prisoners were alive. The 9-man defense had done the impossible. They had held off a far larger German force long enough for help to arrive. Major Joseph Gangle, the German officer who had chosen honor over blind loyalty, was killed by sniper fire during the battle, shielding one of the French prisoners. He would later be remembered as a hero in Austria. For decades, this battle remained largely unknown. It did not fit neatly into the traditional story of World War II. Americans and Germans fighting side by side, French prisoners defending their own captor's fortress, a medieval castle hosting one of the war's final firefights, and at the center of it all, a tiny group of men who refused to walk away when walking away would have been easier. This was not a battle of massive armies or grand strategies. It was a battle of choices, of courage, of 9 men who stood their ground when history expected them to disappear quietly into the chaos of the war's end. And in the next part, we will go deeper into who these men really were, why they chose to fight, and how this forgotten stand at Castle Itter became one of the strangest and most powerful moments of World War II's final days. Asterisk, when the gunfire at Castle Itter briefly faded after the first SS probes. The defenders knew the silence was deceptive. The enemy had not gone away. They were reorganizing, measuring the castle, counting windows, learning how many guns were firing back. For the 9 men holding the line, the quiet moments were often worse than the fighting itself. Silence gave them time to think, and thinking made the reality impossible to ignore. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off. Captain Jack Lee walked the interior of the castle with the calm urgency of a man who knew panic would kill them faster than bullets. He spoke quietly to each position, checking weapons, encouraging his men, reminding them to conserve ammunition. Every rifle mattered. Every magazine was precious. There would be no resupply unless help arrived, and no one knew if help even knew where they were. Major Joseph Gangle moved differently. Where Lee was controlled, Gangle was openly defiant. The German officer had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. By fighting the SS alongside Americans, he had condemned himself in the eyes of the Nazi regime. But Gangle no longer cared about uniforms or orders. For him, this was about protecting Liv's Austrian civilians in the valley, and now the prisoners inside the castle. He knew the SS well. He understood their tactics, their mindset, and their cruelty. That knowledge was both a weapon and a curse. Inside Castle Itter, the French prisoners watched the defenders with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. These were men who had once commanded divisions, negotiated treaties, and shaped European politics. Now they were dependent on a handful of young soldiers barely half their age. The war had stripped away all illusions of power. What remained was raw humanity. Some of the prisoners insisted on helping more directly. Against Captain Lee's initial reluctance, a few were allowed to man positions inside the castle using captured German weapons. It was a strange reversal of fate, former captives firing at their former guards, defending a fortress that had once held them against their will. The sound of their rifles echoed through stone corridors that had known centuries of peace before the war twisted them into a battlefield. Outside the walls, the SS commander assessed the situation with growing frustration. This was supposed to be a simple operation: seize the castle, eliminate the prisoners, and vanish into the mountains. Instead, they had encountered stubborn resistance. The SS could not simply charge the gate. The narrow approach road and thick walls made that suicidal. They needed to break the defenders psychologically, force them to surrender, or weaken them enough for a final assault. Snipers were positioned on surrounding slopes. Shots cracked against the castle, forcing defenders to stay low. Anyone who exposed themselves to long risked instant death. The SS began firing mortar rounds more deliberately now, walking explosions closer to key defensive points. Each blast shook the castle like an earthquake, raining dust and debris from the ceiling. With every impact, the defenders wondered if the next one would punch through the ancient stone. The disabled Sherman tank at the gate became a symbol of their vulnerability. Once, it had been their strongest deterrent. Now it was a silent, smoking reminder that they were running out of options. Captain Lee considered abandoning the gate and retreating deeper into the castle, but doing so would give the SS a clear path forward. Holding the gate, even symbolically, mattered as the hours passed. Exhaustion set in. The men had barely slept. Adrenaline kept them moving, but it could not erase hunger or fear. Every sound was analyzed, every shadow suspected. The defenders spoke less now. Words felt unnecessary. They communicated through glances, gestures, shared understanding forged under fire. Major Gangle continued to expose himself to danger, moving between positions despite sniper fire. He shouted warnings in German when SS units attempted to maneuver, his voice echoing across the valley. Some SS soldiers recognized him. They knew who he was and what he was doing. That made him a special target. Gangle knew it too. Still, he refused to take cover for long. If he was going to die, it would be doing something that mattered. Inside, the French prisoners felt the pressure mounting. One of them suggested surrender, hoping the SS might spare their lives. Gangle immediately rejected the idea. He knew better. Surrender to the SS at this stage of the war meant execution, especially for men of political significance. There would be no negotiations. The SS had come to kill, not to talk. Captain Lee faced an impossible decision. If he ordered a breakout, they might escape under cover of confusion. But the prisoners, many elderly and weak, would never make it. If he stayed, they risked annihilation. Lee chose to stay. He chose to fight for people he had met only hours earlier, in a war that was officially already ending. At mid-morning, the SS launched a more coordinated attack. Machine gun teams laid down suppressive fire, while small groups advanced between bursts. The defenders responded with everything they had. Rifles overheated, hands shook from recoil and stress. One American soldier was hit and dragged to cover, his blood staining the stone floor. There was no Manek. Wounds were bound with torn cloth and determination. During this phase of the battle, one of the French prisoners performed an act that would later become legendary. Despite being well into his 60s, he exposed himself to enemy fire to pass ammunition to a threatened position. Bullets struck the wall inches from him. He survived by sheer luck and stubbornness. For a moment, the war seemed to collapse. Time itself, old men and young soldiers sharing the same fear, the same courage. Then tragedy struck as the SS intensified their pressure. A sniper found Major Gangle. The shot came from the tree line, precise and unforgiving. Gangle fell while shielding one of the French prisoners from fire. The man who had chosen to fight against his own countrymen for the sake of others died without seeing the battle's end. His death hit the defenders hard. Gangle had been more than an ally. He had been proof that the war was not simply nations against nations, but people making choices. For a brief moment, Despair threatened to take hold. If even Gangle could be killed, what chance did the rest of them have? But his sacrifice also hardened their resolve. Captain Lee took over coordination fully now, pushing the men to hold just a little longer. Somewhere out there, he hoped, American forces were advancing. Somewhere someone might hear the gunfire and investigate. It was a thin hope, but it was all they had. Ammunition dwindled further. Some rifles were down to their last clips. The SS, sensing weakness, pressed closer. Their voices could be heard clearly, now shouts orders, the sound of boots on stone. The castle felt smaller, the walls less solid. Every defender understood that the final assault was coming, and yet they did not run. They stayed in their positions, firing when they could, refusing to give the SS an easy victory. Each second they delayed was another second the prisoners lived. Another second closer to rescue, at least to an ending they could face standing up, as the sun climbed higher over the Alps. The battle reached a brutal stalemate. Neither side could deliver the final blow. The defenders were nearly spent. The attackers were growing impatient. The outcome hung on one question: would help arrive in time. That question would be answered in the next part, when the forgotten battle of Castle Itter reached its most desperate and decisive moments, moments that would turn a hopeless stand into a story that defied everything people thought they knew about World War II. By early afternoon on May 5, 1945, the fight for Castle Itter had entered its most dangerous phase. The SS forces surrounding the fortress were no longer testing defenses or probing for weaknesses. They were preparing to end it. For them, time was now the enemy. Every hour increased the chance that American units advancing through Austria might stumble upon the battle. The SS needed a decisive strike hand. They needed it soon. Inside the castle, the defenders felt the shift immediately. The pattern of fire changed. Instead of scattered bursts, the SS laid down sustained, overlapping machine gun fire. The intention was clear: pin the defenders down, then move in close. Mortar rounds followed, slamming into the slopes just below the walls, sending stone fragments flying through the air like shrapnel. Each explosion echoed through the ancient corridors, making it feel as though the castle itself was screaming. Captain Jack Lee crouched behind a window embrasure, scanning the approaches with binoculars. What he saw made his stomach tighten. The SS were reorganizing in disciplined groups, moving with purpose. These were not frightened boys trying to escape the end of the war. These were fanatics, men who believed surrender was betrayal and death in battle was preferable to capture. Lee understood what that meant. There would be no mercy, no retreat, and no hesitation. The loss of Major Joseph Gangle weighed heavily on everyone. His body lay inside the castle, covered respectfully, but there had been no time to grieve. Gangle's death marked a turning point. He had been the bridge between understanding the enemy and predicting them. Now, the defenders had to rely on instinct and observation alone. A sense of isolation pressed down on the castle like a physical weight. The radio in the disabled Sherman tank was still dead. No messages in, no messages out. For all they knew, the rest of the world had already moved on. The war might be ending everywhere else, but at Castle Itter, it was very much alive. The SS began their final approach shortly after noon. Smoke grenades were thrown toward the gate, filling the air with thick gray clouds that clung to the stone. Visibility dropped sharply. Through the haze, shadows moved quick, deliberate, dangerous. The defenders fired when they saw movement, but every shot was a gamble. Waste too much ammunition, and there would be nothing left when the enemy reached the walls. One American soldier was hit in the leg and collapsed behind cover, gritting his teeth to avoid screaming. Another took a bullet through his helmet that miraculously failed to penetrate. Each near miss rattled nerves already stretched thin. These men were beyond fear now. What they felt was a cold, focused determination, the kind that comes when there is no longer any room for doubt. Inside, the French prisoners gathered in the central hall, listening to the battle inch closer. Some prayed quietly. Others simply stared at the stone walls, as if trying to memorize them. They knew what awaited them if the SS broke through. Years of imprisonment had taught them one truth above all others: survival was never guaranteed, and dignity sometimes mattered more than life. As SS troops reached the outer approaches, hand grenades began to arc toward the castle. Explosions tore chunks out of walls and staircases. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. One grenade rolled dangerously close to a group of defenders before being kicked back through a window in a desperate split-second act. It exploded outside, showering the attackers instead. The fight had become brutal and personal. At one point, SS soldiers managed to get dangerously close to the main gate. Automatic fire ripped across the entrance, chipping away at wood and iron. If the gate failed, the defenders would be overwhelmed in minutes. Captain Lee rushed to the position, firing his rifle until the barrel burned his hands. He shouted orders, his voice hoarse but steady. Leadership in moments like this was not about rank, it was about presence. And Lee's presence kept the line from collapsing. Then, just as the situation seemed beyond saving, something unexpected happened. From the valley below, the sound of heavy gunfire erupted, not directed at the castle, but at the SS positions themselves. At first, the defenders thought it was another SS maneuver, but the rhythm was wrong. The weapons were different, louder, more aggressive. American weapons. Confusion rippled through the SS ranks. Shouts turned frantic. Some soldiers broke cover and ran, only to be cut down by fire from behind. Others tried to regroup, but it was too late. The 142nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army had arrived. The American infantry had been advancing rapidly through the area and had picked up reports of SS activity near Itter when they heard sustained gunfire from the hills. They moved to investigate. What they found was a concentrated SS force attacking a castle, something no one had expected in the final days of the war. The arrival of fresh American troops changed everything in seconds. The SS, now caught between the castle defenders and a new enemy attacking from the rear, lost all tactical advantage. Their carefully planned assault collapsed into chaos. Some tried to fight their way out, others threw down their weapons and surrendered. A few attempted to flee into the forest, only to be hunted down or captured later. Inside the castle, the defenders could barely believe what they were seeing. The pressure eased almost instantly. The sound of SS fire diminished, replaced by shouts in English and the unmistakable crack of American rifles advancing uphill. Men who had been seconds away from death slumped against walls, exhausted, laughing, and shaking at the same time. Captain Lee lowered his weapon and took a long breath. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe they had survived. The battle ended quickly after that. SS resistance collapsed completely within the hour. Castle Itter, battered but unbroken, was finally secure. The French prisoners emerged from their hiding places, blinking in the sunlight, scarcely able to comprehend that they were free and alive, but victory came at a cost. Major Joseph Gangel's body was carried out with honor. The French prisoners insisted on paying tribute to the man who had died protecting them. In that moment, the lines between friend and enemy, victor and defeated, seemed meaningless. What mattered was the choice Gangel had made, and the price he had paid for it. American soldiers who arrived after the fighting were stunned by what they found. A medieval castle, high-ranking French prisoners, a destroyed Sherman tank, and the knowledge that, for hours, fewer than a dozen men had held off a determined SS force. It was the kind of story that sounded exaggerated, almost fictional, and perhaps that is why it would later be forgotten. As the prisoners were prepared for evacuation, one of them turned to Captain Lee and thanked him simply, quietly. There were no speeches, no medals handed out on the spot, just a handshake between men who had shared something few others could ever understand. The war, for most of Europe, was ending. But for those who had fought at Castle Itter, its final days would remain etched in memory forever. They had stood in a place where the rules of the war broke down, where Americans and Germans fought together, where prisoners became defenders, and where courage mattered more than flags. In the final part, we will look at what happened after the battle, how history nearly erased this incredible stand, how the survivors carried it with them, and why the forgotten Battle of Castle Itter still matters today, more than 70 years later. Asterisk, when the guns finally fell silent around Castle Itter, the quiet felt unreal. For hours, the sound of rifle fire, explosions, and shouted orders had filled the mountain air. Now there was only wind moving through the trees and the distant rumble of American vehicles passing through the valley. The battle was over, but its meaning had not yet begun to sink in. The French prisoners were evacuated under American protection later that day. Many were physically weak after years of captivity, but emotionally they carried something far heavier. They had survived not because of politics or negotiations, but because a small group of men had refused to abandon them when abandoning them would have been the safest choice. For men who had once shaped the destiny of nations, this was a humbling realization. Captain Jack Lee was offered praise by his superiors, but the war's end came so quickly that there was little time for formal recognition. Germany surrendered just days later. Attention shifted to rebuilding, to victory parades, to the enormous task of making sense of what the war had done to the world. In that flood of history, the fight at a small Austrian castle barely registered. Joseph Gangel's story, however, did not disappear entirely. In Austria, he became a symbol of resistance and moral courage. Streets were later named after him. Monuments were raised in his honor. For Austrians who wanted to believe that not everyone had blindly followed the Nazi regime, Gangel represented proof that choice had always existed, even in the darkest times. For the American soldiers who fought at Castle Itter, the experience lingered quietly. They returned home to a country eager to move forward, not to listen to strange stories about fighting alongside German officers in medieval castles. Many of them rarely spoke about it. The war had ended. Life demanded attention. Families were built. Jobs were taken. Memories were folded away and carried silently. And so, one of the most unusual battles of World War II slipped through the cracks of history. It did not fit the familiar narrative. World War II stories are often told in clean lines: Allies versus Axis, good versus evil, victory versus defeat. Castle Itter refused to obey those rules. Americans and Germans fought side by side. SS troops fought against fellow Germans. French prisoners picked up weapons to defend the very walls that had once confined them. There was no clear script for such a story, and without a script, history often forgets. Yet the importance of the battle was never about its size or strategic value. Castle Itter did not change the course of the war. It did not decide the fate of nations. What it did was something far more rare. It revealed the human side of war at the exact moment when humanity seemed most lost. The men who defended the castle were not superheroes. They were tired, scared, and unsure if they would live to see the next hour. Their courage was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and stubborn. It was the decision to stay when leaving was easier. The decision to protect strangers because it was the right thing to do. Captain Lee later reflected that he never felt like a hero. To him, the choice had been simple. People were in danger. He had the means to help. So he acted. That mindset, more than any medal or headline, defined the spirit of the battle. The French prisoners carried the story with them into the post-war world. Some wrote about it. Others spoke of it in interviews years later, still amazed that their lives had been saved by such an unlikely alliance. For them, Castle Itter became proof that even in a war defined by cruelty, moments of honor could still exist. As historians slowly uncovered the details, the battle began to gain recognition as the last major engagement in the European theater of World War II. But more than that, it became known as one of the war's strangest moments, a place where the lines between enemy and ally blurred completely. Today, Castle Itter still stands. Its walls are quiet again. Tourists visit, unaware that these stones once shook under machine gun fire and mortar blasts. There are no massive monuments, no dramatic reenactments, just a small reminder that history does not always announce its most powerful moments with grand gestures. The forgotten battle, where 9 men stopped an army, matters because it challenges the way we remember war. It reminds us that numbers do not always decide outcomes, that loyalty to humanity can be stronger than loyalty to ideology, and that even at the end of a brutal global conflict, individuals still had the power to choose courage over fear. World War II officially ended with signatures and ceremonies. But its true ending was written in countless small moments like this. One moment where people decided what kind of world would exist after the fighting stopped. At Castle Itter, a handful of men chose to defend life instead of surrendering to hatred. They did not know they were making history. They only knew what was right. And perhaps that is why this story, forgotten for so long, deserves to be remembered now.